When Russian forces crossed the Ukrainian border on February 24, 2022, the world saw a dramatic escalation that would dominate global headlines, reshape Europe's security architecture, and send shockwaves through the global economy. But the decision to invade was not made in a vacuum, and the conflict certainly did not begin in 2022. To understand why the war began and who is truly behind it, one must go far beyond recent events and dig into the layers of history, identity, strategic thinking, and political maneuvering that stretch back centuries. Ukraine and Russia share intertwined histories under empires, overlapping cultures, and centuries of disputes over sovereignty. Since the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, Ukraine has navigated a path between East and West, trying to define its future in the shadow of its larger, more powerful neighbor. This has made Ukraine the site of a geopolitical tug-of-war between Russia, which sees it as a vital part of its sphere of influence, and the West, which views it as a sovereign nation with the right to choose its alliances. The decision to launch a full-scale invasion in 2022 was shaped by long-standing historical grievances, deep strategic concerns, ideological convictions, and the personal ambitions of Russia's leadership, chiefly President Vladimir Putin. But it was also made possible by the political structures within Russia that concentrate decision-making power in the hands of a few and suppress dissent. Sir. Here is some historical foundations from the Kievan Rus to Imperial Russia. The story begins in the medieval state of Kievan Rus, a loose federation of Slavic tribes with its capital in Kiev. This early polity, existing from the 9th to the 13th century, is claimed as a cultural and spiritual ancestor by both modern Ukrainians and Russians. The Mongol invasions shattered Kievan Rus, and its territories eventually came under the control of various powers: Poland, Lithuania, the Ottoman Empire, and Muscovy. By the mid-17th century, a significant part of Ukrainian lands had fallen under Russian influence through the Treaty of Pereyaslav in 1654, when Cossack leaders sought the Tsar's protection against Poland-Lithuania. This arrangement gradually evolved into full incorporation into the Russian Empire. While Western Ukraine remained under Polish or Austro-Hungarian rule for centuries, the East and Center became deeply integrated with Russian political and economic life. Russification and resistance Russian rule brought attempts to assimilate Ukrainians into a broader Russian identity, restricting the Ukrainian language, promoting Russian orthodoxy, and controlling local elites. While many Ukrainians adapted, others resisted, keeping alive a distinct cultural and national identity. This tension between integration and independence would echo across centuries. Soviet Ukraine. In 1922, Ukraine became one of the founding republics of the Soviet Union, while Soviet propaganda celebrated Ukraine's status as a sister republic. In reality, it was tightly controlled from Moscow. The collectivization of agriculture in the early 1930s led to the Holodomor, a devastating man-made famine that killed millions of Ukrainians. The memory of this tragedy became a cornerstone of Ukrainian national consciousness, particularly after independence. World War II brought more upheaval: Nazi occupation, partisan resistance, and eventual Soviet reoccupation. After the war, Ukraine's borders expanded westward, incorporating territories from Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Romania. The post-war decades saw industrial growth and urbanization, but also continued political subordination to Moscow. Independence in 1991. The collapse of the Soviet Union was the most dramatic geopolitical event of the late 20th century. On August 24, 1991, Ukraine declared independence, later confirmed by a referendum in which more than 90% voted in favor. This included majorities in every region, even Crimea and the Donbass. For Ukraine, it was the start of a new era. For Russia, it was a profound loss, not just of territory, but of a central piece of its historical and strategic identity. At the post-Soviet struggle for Ukraine's direction, the 1990s, fragile independence. The first decade of Ukrainian independence was marked by economic collapse, corruption, and political instability. Russia recognized Ukraine's sovereignty but kept a close eye on its politics. The two countries signed the Budapest Memorandum in 1994, in which Ukraine gave up its nuclear arsenal in exchange for security assurances from Russia, the US, and the UK. Energy became a major point of leverage. Ukraine depended heavily on Russian natural gas, and disputes over pricing and debt led to periodic gas wars in which Russia cut supplies. The Orange Revolution, 2004-2005. In 2004, Ukraine's presidential election became a showdown between Viktor Yanukovych, backed by Moscow, and Viktor Yushchenko, who leaned toward the West. When Yanukovych was declared the winner amid credible allegations of massive fraud, hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians took to the streets. Wearing orange, the color of Yushchenko's campaign, they demanded a new vote. The Supreme Court ordered a rerun, which Yushchenko won. For Russia, the Orange Revolution was alarming. It reinforced the Kremlin's belief that the West was engineering color revolutions in the post-Soviet space to undermine pro-Russian governments and expand Western influence. Yanukovych's return and the Euromaidan crisis, 2010-2014. Yanukovych made a political comeback in 2010, winning the presidency and promising to balance relations between Russia and the EU. But in November 2013, he abruptly rejected a long-negotiated association agreement with the EU, opting instead for closer ties with Russia. This triggered mass protests in Kiev's Maidan Square, demanding European integration and an end to corruption. The protests, known as the Euromaidan movement, escalated into violent clashes with security forces. By February 2014, more than 100 people had been killed, and Yanukovych fled to Russia. A new pro-Western interim government took power, which Moscow denounced as an illegal coup. Crimea and the Donbas War, 2014-2021. In March 2014, Russian forces seized Crimea. A hastily organized referendum, widely rejected as illegitimate, claimed overwhelming support for joining Russia. Moscow annexed the peninsula, securing control over the strategic port of Sevastopol and projecting power in the Black Sea. Meanwhile, in the Donetsk and Luhansk regions of eastern Ukraine, pro-Russian separatists declared people's republics. Backed by Russian weapons, financing, and covert troops, they fought Ukrainian forces in a conflict that killed thousands over the next 8 years. The Minsk Agreements of 2014 and 2015, brokered by France and Germany, aimed to end the fighting. But they were never fully implemented, and low-intensity warfare continued along the front lines. Prior to the invasion happened in 2022, Russia's official narrative. When Putin announced the special military operation in February 2022, he justified it on 4 main grounds. 1. NATO expansion. Russia argued that NATO had broken promises made in the early 1990s not to expand eastward. To historical unity. Putin claimed Ukraine was an inseparable part of Russia's history and culture. Protection of Russian speakers. Moscow accused Kiev of discrimination and aggression against Russian-speaking populations. 4. Denazification. A claim widely dismissed outside Russia that Ukraine's leadership was controlled by extremists. The strategic reality. Most analysts agree that these claims were pretexts for a broader strategic objective: to bring Ukraine back into Russia's orbit, weaken its statehood, and prevent it from joining NATO or the EU. From the Kremlin's perspective, Ukraine's successful integration with the West would be a geopolitical and ideological defeat, proof that a former Soviet republic could thrive as a democratic, independent state. The timing. The decision to invade in 2022 reflected both opportunity and urgency. Ukraine's military had strengthened significantly since 2014, and the window for easy conquest was closing. Globally, the Kremlin may have calculated that the West was distracted by the COVID-19 pandemic, political divisions, and the chaotic U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan. Who is behind the war? Putin's central role. The invasion was ultimately the decision of one man, Vladimir Putin. Over 2 decades in power, Putin had centralized authority to the point where major strategic moves depended on his personal judgment. His worldview, shaped by KGB service, suspicion of the West, and belief in restoring Russia's great power status, was decisive. The Kremlin Inner Circle. Putin's advisors include senior security and military officials, intelligence chiefs, and loyal oligarchs. Institutions like the FSB and GRU played critical roles in both covert operations and information campaigns to justify the war domestically. Broader structural forces. The war also reflects the deeper currents of Russian strategic culture: fear of encirclement, belief in spheres of influence, and the conviction that Russia cannot be secure without control over Ukraine. Insta the war unfolds, 2022-2023. The initial invasion aimed to quickly seize Kyiv and install a pro-Russian government. But Ukrainian resistance, backed by Western intelligence, weapons, and economic sanctions against Russia, halted the advance. Russian forces withdrew from northern Ukraine in April 2022, shifting focus to the east and south. Major battles followed in Mariupol, Severodonetsk, and Bakhmut with devastating destruction. Ukrainian counteroffensives in Kharkiv and Kherson in late 2022 reclaimed significant territory. By early 2023, the war had settled into a grinding attritional conflict with neither side achieving decisive breakthroughs. The war reshaped global politics. NATO, far from retreating, expanded. Finland joined and Sweden moved toward membership. The EU granted Ukraine candidate status. Energy markets were disrupted, causing global inflation. Russia deepened ties with China, Iran, and other non-Western states, framing the conflict as part of a broader struggle against U.S. hegemony. The war between Russia and Ukraine is the product of centuries of intertwined history, decades of post-Soviet political struggle, and the strategic, ideological, and personal calculations of Russia's leadership. While Putin and his inner circle are directly responsible for the decision to invade, the conflict's roots run far deeper, into historical memory, competing visions of national identity, and the geopolitical contest for Eastern Europe's future.